scholars today. We also have quite a few of our Planté Fellows joining us, so we want to welcome everybody to this very special workshop that we're hosting today. The title of our workshop is Creating a Compelling Science Conference Presentation, and our presenter today, live, is JossRose. And Joss is the professor in the plant biology section at the School of Integrative Plant Sciences and the director of the Institute of Biotechnology at Cornell University. And before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few things just to make sure you get the most again out of attending this workshop. So while we do let you self-mute, feel free to ask questions in the chat box that's located in the GoToTraining control panel on the right. Mary and I will stop and read these questions during the seminar. There's also, for this presentation, since it's the webcam that we're showing and the science presentation, there is a gray slide bar that you can use to adjust your webcam screen to make it a little bit, and I would suggest making it larger, so you might want to split your screen between the size of the webcam box and the size of the presentation. And we're recording the seminar, so the seminar, along with any associated materials, we're going to make available to you as soon as possible. And again, if you need any technical assistance at all during the webinar, just feel free to email me at mbinder@aspb.org. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn the seminar over to Joss.
Thanks very much, Melanie. So this is a seminar within a seminar, right? So I'm giving a seminar about giving a seminar. So I'm going to briefly introduce myself. So I'm a faculty member at biology. And one of the things I do as part of my job is I give presentation training. Now, this is real time. I'm hearing all sorts of background noises, so we can adjust this. But this is good.
Yeah.
What I want to try and help you today is give you some advice and suggestions on how to give these sorts of presentations. We have a number of students that come to Cornell every year through a summer research program. As part of that, at the end of the summer, they present their research. And I get up the week before and say, first of all, don't panic, okay? This is your typical reaction when you have to give a seminar and one tends to go into panic mode. So what I'm going to do today is give you some suggestions and advice on how you might give a scientific presentation. You've heard many sorts of presentations, I'm sure, in the past, given by different people with different styles. There's no one perfect way of doing things, but there are some common themes, the things I think I might be able to give advice with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about preparation for giving a presentation and then how to deliver it and deal with the aftermath as well. So it's very nice. I understand that I'm giving this presentation to people around the world, which is exciting, and I hope that it's helpful. And please feel free to get back in touch afterwards if you have any questions. So I'm going to look back now and say I've been introduced by Melanie. Prior to my talk, I have been wired for sound. This is something you might have happen to you. So you got a little microphone. Okay. If you can practice making sure it's working properly, that's a good thing to do. You've all seen seminars where people are tying themselves up in knots trying to deal with these things. If you can practice that, that's good. Make sure the microphone is working, it's attached, and make sure that everybody can hear you. So to do is to think about the props that you have when you talk. Number one, turn this off. Okay, so I've been in talks where people get phone calls from their girlfriend in the middle of the seminar, and it's a bit distracting. Turn your phone off. Sometimes it's helpful to have a bottle of water or something to keep you moist. And then this is the other thing we commonly have, a laser pointer. And hopefully you can see this on the screen. Laser pointer is for indicating what you're talking about. It's not for using it as a death ray to blind people in the front audience. So make sure you point it in the right direction and keep control of it, okay? You may also have an advancing instrument. So basically a bit of kit where you press the button and it takes you to the next slide. Again, if you can practice using that before your presentation, that's sometimes very helpful, okay? So you're not flying back and forward. So get wired up, get comfortable. You'll be introduced by somebody. You come on stage, okay? The first thing I suggest you do is always thank the person. Thank the person or the institute or the organization that has invited you. So I'm going to say thank you very much, Melanie, for the opportunity to come and give a talk to you today. It's a real privilege, and I'm looking forward to that. So you thank whoever's invited you and brought you up on stage. That's very important. It sets the scene. Now let's go back to the don't panic thing, okay? So some of you will have given lots of presentations. Some of you will not have given very many. But a common theme is almost everybody has that, we'll call it nausea, has that sensation of adrenaline, excitement. They're not quite sure how this talk's going to go, but it can be quite intimidating. And so I want to give you some suggestions as to how to think about this. First of all, put it in perspective, okay? Nobody is going to attack you, and you're not a bad person, right? This talk, you standing on this stage and giving a presentation to all of these people is far, far more significant to you than it is to anybody else in the room. They've come up, you've been to talks, you come up, you have your coffee, you want to go, oh, let's go and see what this guy's got to talk about. It's not something that the audience feel anxious about, okay? So it has great significance for you, but they're here because they want to hear you. They want to hear what you've got to say. They're interested. They're on your side. They want you to give a relaxed, calm, and exciting presentation, okay? And the other thing to remember is you will have practiced, and this is going to be my mantra today, practice, practice, practice. You will have practiced this talk many, many times. And as a consequence, you will do a great job, okay? So it's important to bear this in mind. Now, I'm sitting here, you can't see this, but there's a fairly large auditorium of red seats with absolutely nobody here. I'm all by myself, which it feels rather strange. Normally, I'm looking around the room and I'm engaging with the audience. I'm looking at people's faces and they're reacting. They're smiling, I hope. They're looking quite comfortable. Sometimes they're laughing. They're looking focused. But I'm getting some reaction off of the audience, and that can be very helpful. It's not always the case. Sometimes you can be on a large stage, an auditorium, and it's quite dark. You're here, and you're feeling quite alone and by yourself, okay? So this is where you go into science mode, and you are remembering you're a scientist, you have your data, your results, and you're going to present. And the audience is out there, whether you can see them or not, and they're interested and they want to hear you do a good job. So you will have practiced and you will do a great job, okay? So put it in context. Another thing that's very important to bear in mind is that you're here to tell a story. You're here to entertain the audience. So you want to, when you design your presentation, think about that. You want to make sure that there's what's called a narrative flow. First of all, who is your audience? Who are you talking to? Now, sometimes for my summer students, when I give this presentation, my audience are typically high school students or undergraduates. When they're here and they're learning about this and they're a little bit anticipating the next couple of weeks, they've got to give their talk and so on. There's a little bit of nervous laughter and they're all furiously writing down notes. It's very important for them. Sometimes I'm giving talks to members of the public. Sometimes I'm giving talks to my colleagues in my department or other institutions. So think about the kinds of information you want to give and how you will entertain different sorts of audiences. So for the undergraduates, I tend to be very animated and jump up and down and sometimes tell little stories and make it extremely informal, okay? And it'll be along those lines today. It's somewhat informal. Sometimes if I'm giving a talk, though, that's the end of to a conference, a seminar, in a large international audience, I might slow it down and I might make things much more sober and focused, okay? So think about whether you want to keep things very open and encourage questions, or whether you want to make it a much more standard, typical presentation. How long to have your presentation? So a rule of thumb is it's basically the number of slides should be the same as the number of minutes. So 20-minute presentation, 20 slides, okay? And then you want to leave about 5 minutes at the end, typically for questions. Now, normally when you get invited to give a talk, the organizers or the conference will give you information. So you'll see your time slot. And a typical time slot is a very common one is 20 minutes, which generally means 15 minutes for you presenting and leaving 5 minutes for questions, or 80 minutes and 2, or somewhere around there. But what you want to do is walk into that room and you want to balance it, to have about 15 minutes, so 15 slides. Bear in mind, though, of course, you will have practiced this many, many times, so you will know, you'll have timed yourself, and you'll know pretty much how long your talk is going to be. Typically, especially for those who are not very experienced with doing this, it tends to be that you end up talking more than you think you will. Talks tend to go long. It's not often that you go into a seminar and it finishes 15 minutes early. So typically, you will end up talking a lot more and saying things that you haven't actually practiced. And you're thinking, why am I saying this? But you're talking about what you know, and it's nervous energy, okay? So don't be tempted to say, oh, but I practiced and I can squeeze in 20 slides into 15 minutes. Stick to the 1 minute per slide rule. And if you finish a little bit earlier, that's okay. It's generally, it's not a good idea to run over, okay? In a conference, that can mess up scheduling. Quite often the organizer will get up and cut you off and say, we need to finish now, so you don't get to present your conclusions, okay? It's also not respectful of other people's time. So better to run a little bit short and go long. So 1 minute per slide. Think about the flow and the arc of the story. So explain to the audience what you're going to say it, and then reiterate and say what you said, okay? So 3 phases. When I got up to start this webinar, I got up and said, my name is so-and-so, and I'm going to be talking to you about this. I explained what I was going to say. I'm now in mode 2, and you'll notice at the end, I'll come back and I'll reiterate and explain what I explained to you. And I think a reasonable way of doing this, I think, is to think about your presentation somewhat similar, somewhat analogous to a manuscript, a paper. So you have an introduction, you give background to the audience. They're not experts, most of them. Materials and methods, what you did. The results, what you saw, what you learned. And then at the end, you finish with the discussion. You review. And then the very last thing, we'll come back to this again, acknowledgements. Okay? So it's got this nice narrative. You build things up, you build up interest, you provide a platform with the introduction, you talk about the science you did, the context, the conclusions, and you finish the presentation, okay? So just think about that narrative arc as you go through. And you want to balance the number of slides according to that. You don't want in a 15-slide presentation 12 slides as an introduction, okay? So you want to think about distributing it equally. Okay, so this is some of the technicalities now, some of the practical stuff, okay? And again, I'm going to give you my feelings, my thoughts, my suggestions, and everyone's different, okay? Everyone has different aesthetics, different ideas, but I will tell you some of the technical things that are fact and things you might want to bear in mind, okay? You've been to many talks, I'm sure. Different kinds of styles of slides and different sorts can work equally well, okay? But I'm going to give you some hints. Let's talk about slide format to start with. So first of all, background colors is quite important. It lays the groundwork for your presentation. So quite often you'll see dark blue as being quite restful. I'm not sure if we can see this. Is it possible to lower the lights a little bit in here, just to drop it, just a shade, so we can see some of the colors? Now the lights should be coming down. And this is the sort of thing that can happen to you live. Can we go, okay. I think that's going to be all right, actually. So this can happen live, right? You want to do something on the fly, and you should get comfortable in your presentation with breaking out of your narrative and doing something else. I would go down a little bit if we possibly can, yeah. So I want to talk about the background slides, okay? Oh, that's quite good. This looks like a typical seminar kind of background, okay? So hopefully you can see the laser pointer. This is a dark blue background. It's very restful. It's very peaceful. Okay, psychologists talk about dark blue as being a very peaceful color. And you'll find that it's very helpful for presenting dark images. If you're showing microscopy images or dark slides, a dark blue background is very good. It's very effective. Things will pop out quite nicely in these sorts of backgrounds. Black can work for high contrast, but I wouldn't necessarily advise using it all the time. It can be a bit much, a bit gloomy. So you can vary your slides. Some people have told me, oh, but you shouldn't change the background color on your slides all the time. I think it's okay to change it once in a while. There's no reason why you should stick to one single aesthetic going all the way through. You use different background slides, different background colors for different reasons. But you can see, hopefully, this picture of a root fluorescing pops out very, very nicely. Whereas if you put it on a white slide, white background, not so much. When you're in the audience and lots of bright white light comes at you, immediately your pupils constrict, okay, so the light coming in is less. In a dark background, they'll dilate, and you'll receive more of this color, okay? White backgrounds can be fine. I think perhaps, again, you don't want all white necessarily. It can be a bit monotonous and a bit tiring on the eyes if it's all white. So varying it can be fine. The dangers of PowerPoint. So PowerPoint's a wonderful tool, and it gives you all sorts of very exciting novelty backgrounds. So this is one I pulled out. It can be amusing for a couple of minutes, but it gets very distracting. Okay, I'm not sure quite what this is, but it gave it as a suggestion in PowerPoint. Avoid that, and then, yeah, that's not good. Okay, so I don't even want that pea green background. So there are all sorts of options. Think very carefully about how you present these things. And again, as you walk down the street, you see 100 people walk past. Some look as though they're very well put together. Some people clearly have less of an aesthetic sense, right? Mix and match very interesting ways. So I suggest, as always, with anything you put together, ask for advice and suggestions. Your friends can tell you, how does that look as a color combination? This doesn't work. Strong contrasting colors can be very effective. And I've just thrown this color wheel together, and you can have a black background and see the sorts of colors that pop. Okay, what works, what looks very interesting. You can mix it up a little bit. You can change between slides. So think about your color combinations and what you want to do. I personally find that dark backgrounds with big white boxes on top of them don't look very appealing, but text can work very nicely. Quite often you're talking in a very large conference room. Okay, this can happen with people a long way away from the screen. So having high contrast can be very effective. High contrast and large size of font is generally a good rule of thumb. So choose your color for contrast. Red, as you can see, doesn't actually work very well on a dark blue background. You can see, if you can read this at the back of a room in white much more effectively than you can in red. But yellow and white do, and all sorts of other light, bright, primary colors. Okay, drop it right down. Pastels work very well on this dark background. And again, the point of the presentation is to entertain and is to make sure that everybody can read and see what's on your slides. If you've got somebody at the back of the room that can't actually see what you've written, can't quite hear, perhaps they're a long way away, that's not optimal. Okay, so think very carefully about your color schemes and how you design that for your slide.
Hi, Joss. It's Melanie.
Hi, Melanie.
How are you? We just noticed that since the room now is a little darker, it makes you dark, and some of the text is getting blurred.
Okay.
A little bit, so maybe we'll meet a little halfway in between it. I wonder if that's possible with the lights in the room.
Bring the light up a little bit, perhaps. Yep. Thanks for jumping in on that.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
No problem.
Now, so that brings me to something that's important. As you give your talks, sometimes you'll find that there will be people in the audience that will raise their hand or not and just call out and interrupt you. Now, if you're going through your talk and you've practiced it many times and you've got your 18 slides and you know what you want to say, having somebody jump in and say, hang on a minute, excuse me, why, and ask a question. I've seen that can be quite distracting and disruptive for the person giving the talk, and they have a hard time getting back on the rails and picking that momentum up, okay? So bear that in mind as you give your talk. You can get interrupted. Don't let it throw you, okay? And you answer the question as best you can. It's also perfectly acceptable to say, if you don't mind, I would like to save that question to the end, and I would like to keep going. You can do whatever you feel most comfortable doing, and it's your stage. You get to choose the rules, okay? So if you don't want to choose to answer that question at that time in the middle of a presentation, that's okay. I'm happy to accommodate Melanie and the slides, so I'll do that. We stop, and I'll get back on tracks. But just anticipate you may get interrupted. So font is very important and should be the correct size, okay? You have this area here, and it's remarkable how often I've seen presentations where all the text is confined to this little area in the middle of the slide with a big blue border that's unused around the outside, right? So think about designing your slides, but use the width of the slide. One caveat to that is quite often when you're giving seminars where there's not a rake to the room, that everything's fairly flat, this area across the bottom, say the bottom, oh, I don't know, 10%, is not necessarily visible to those at the back of the room. So what I try to do is, you can see I always leave my slides a little margin along the bottom. Typically, all this, though, is game, and you should be using that space, okay? That's available to you, larger and bigger and bolder. Use that room because you want to have people able to see what you're writing throughout that space. So font as large as possible. Bold, ironically, is quite often not so easy to read. So what will happen is that for bold fonts, the thickness of the lettering will increase, and it crushes the space between the different strokes of the letters, and it can actually make it harder to distinguish some of those letters. So generally, larger font, but I would try and stay away from bold font. There are various kinds of fonts you can use, and typically sans serif is easier to use than serif. And if you're not sure, just to remind you what this is, so serif is this format where along the stroke of a letter, the width of the line varies. And a very classic one for this is Times New Roman. Sans serif, you have equal width across the entire stroke of a letter. So very commonly used sans serif fonts might be Arial or Calibri. There are several others. And these are very effective and easier to read than something like Times New Roman. Times New Roman works beautifully if you're sitting there reading a newspaper or a magazine or a book, or even looking at a poster. It can be quite effective. But in a conference room, I would avoid this. One thing you should bear in mind, though, is please be consistent. Okay, whatever you do, be consistent across all of your slides. Stick to the same font. And it can be very distracting to have different fonts thrown together on a slide, and it looks sloppy. And this is something I'll probably come back to later. But in general, the aesthetics, the way in which you design and prepare your slides, the colors, the thought, the balance, how everything's put together is enormously important. Make it interesting, okay? So I've just taken some of the font before, and here we have a slide where it's all just text, which is okay, and you'll talk about the various points, and we'll discuss this. But if you pop a slide in, it doesn't matter what it is. It can be a graphic, it can be a logo, anything at all. It makes it so much more interesting. Your brain will remember that slide and be drawn to looking at that much more than seeing a line of text. Okay? If you have text alone, the tendency is you might want to switch off and let it wash over you. If you have a graphic on every slide, it'll help grab your attention. Okay? Animation can be very effective as a tool if you have a busy slide. And again, PowerPoint is all wired up with doing all of these fancy animation options. It can be extremely useful. If you want to present multiple ideas, so you have lots of data in different panels, for example, on the slide, and you want to present it and roll it out fairly carefully in a fairly measured way. So I would click this, I would talk about this idea, this result, look at this, and so on. And then I animate it, and I show a little bit more data. And this allows the audience to focus. If I come up and show this straight away, immediately on one slide, then the audience's eyes will be doing this. They don't know where to look. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Do they quickly try and cover everything, or go this way or that way? So you guide the audience along the lines of what you want to present. So you start off by this area, and then you move on to this area down here. So animation can be a very effective way of showing multiple things if you need to show them in the same panel. Sometimes you might want to break these into different slides, but sometimes there are reasons for showing this all in one place. And breaking things down, it allows the audience to focus. Now, it's a bit tricky for you guys with this webinar because you've got all your slides in front of you, and you can fast forward and go through everything I'm going to say. So in this case, some of that spontaneity is gone. That's okay. Quite often you might want to break down a line of points and almost build tension. So in these experiments, we concluded this. We did this, and we did this, and you conclude, and you bring everything to a crescendo, really. You build up that tension. So if you do that with animation, it can be very useful. I wouldn't over-animate, okay, and that can be dangerous as well. So again, PowerPoint can be a little bit dangerous. Don't go crazy, and there's all sorts of spinning and twisting and grooving on down when you have things in some of these PowerPoint options that are buried in the depths of the software. But judiciously used, it can be extremely helpful. You're going to repeat some things here. Make sure that your text is large enough and centered. This is neither. So it should be in the middle of the slide. If you want to show something, sometimes you want to have a high impact pow, big, and grab everyone's attention. Okay, exclamation mark, something like this. In this case, maybe you don't want to have a graphic, but that's probably a rare exception. Again, things you don't want to do. Make sure your text is large enough and centered, and then it's absolutely aligned. PowerPoint's wonderful with all these tools for cropping and slicing and aligning, and there should be a button that just says OCD, right? Everything is tracked and set up absolutely perfectly. So there's really no excuse for having something like this, where the spacing between lines is unequal. Look, this is spaced in a certain way, but that's not equal. This is not aligned properly, and there are spelling mistakes. It looks untidy and messy. And here's the thing. If you're giving a presentation and everything is beautifully laid out and designed and symmetrical, and it just looks appealing, then you think, well, this person clearly cares about what they're doing. They clearly care about that presentation. They've put their thought into it. They've really spent some time, are invested in it. And if they're invested in their presentation, there's a pretty good chance that they're also thoughtful and careful and invested in the original science they did in the lab. If it's messy and careless, not thoughtfully put together, and there are spelling mistakes, and it's thrown into the software, maybe this person hasn't been quite so thoughtful and careful in the first place in how they designed their science. Now, of course, there's not a direct correlation, but it gives this impression, okay? And you've, I'm sure, all been to presentations that are not nicely designed, and it's just less attractive. If something's beautifully put together, it creates a nice atmosphere. Once more, you don't want to slide with lots and lots of space on here, right? So what you could have done is to space things out, or perhaps combine things, or use another figure. So what I've done here is use that same text, the same font, but I put some sort of logo. There'll be something up there. And it just looks much more interesting. Your brain is more engaged. It will grab your attention. All right. Something else very important, and this is something that you have to really work on, particularly if you have attended early on in your career. You want to start off and you want to sort of practice how to give presentations. It's really important that you get used to not reading things off slides. Everybody in the audience will be able to read the slide much more quickly than you can say it. So by the time you've got halfway through, they'll have read it, and then it's dead space, okay? So it's important to get to this idea of how to summarize results. So what I've done here, I've given an example. So this, I will in this case read it. We detected the activity of a P6K phosphatase protein in roots and leaves and showed that it is important for cell expansion. We also showed that the protein is glycosylated in the Golgi. Now, you can read this and tell that results to the audience, and by the time you get to this, they'll have read it all. Another way to show it that's much more attractive and interesting is just to pop this up, this little slide here, P6K phosphatase, and then a summary of what you've learned about that particular protein. Now, this is much more interesting. You can have a graphic and do something, and it's saved all that writing. The audience doesn't want to sit and read blocks of text. Okay, it's not an effective way of presenting. But you need text for, as a presenter, to nudge the audience with some nouns and verbs, and also to give you a reminder as you're presenting, what do I want to say about this slide? So what I've done is just pull out those key points and list it. So you can, by doing this, just learning this section here, you can read it. You can then verbally expand out these key points, okay? So learning how to transition between this or this can be a very important thing to practice.
Hi, Joss. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So we had a couple, this is Natalie. We had a couple of questions come through in the chat box here, and one of them has to do with the layout of slides, and we've noticed in recent PowerPoint there's the square and the rectangular setting. So do you have a preference if the organizers of a conference don't give you a recommendation? How do you deal with that?
So if the organizer of a conference just say you're giving a talk and they don't tell you anything about presentation style, you mean?
Oh, I'm referring to the dimensions of the slide. Let's see, there seems to be what are the dimensions? Like a square setting and also an elongated rectangular setting?
Yeah, so almost always there is what's called standard screen, okay, which you find in PowerPoint. So you can customize your screen size in PowerPoint, or you can go to standard, okay? And you want to use a standard presentation. Don't choose 8.5 by 11 mode for printers. Choose the standard slide in the printing option, and that will set you up. And it'll always be landscape or portrait. Always choose landscape, okay? And then, depending on whichever room, the organizers will always set this up. In this particular room, because of these dimensions and the way this is all set up, this is a presentation here. and there are actually black borders. You may find that, but your computer will deal with that perfectly well. So standard screen size, and it will set it up as an overall rectangle. Okay?
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So we talked a little bit about summarizing text. This is my personal beef, and I'm going to, you can decide for yourselves what you think, is my suggestion. Quite often, you'll want to present your own results or those of others taken from papers or from dissertation or something you've written or prepared with a white background. This is an example I've just pulled out of a manuscript arbitrarily, thrown this up on the screen, and I might want to talk about this. It's about fungal development, and it's some pictures of some hyphae growing. And I might, as a prelude to my presentation, want to show this. So blah, 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 text, 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 white box, white box. Now, I've seen this very, very often, grabbing stuff off the internet as an introduction and throwing it onto a slide as a box with figure written here, figure written here, just cut and pasted, okay? And this, for me, is unforgivable laziness, okay? I think you can spend a few minutes and tidy this up. And I want to just illustrate what I mean by this. There's lots of text. You can't quite see it very well. You're wasting space, and you're not considering the audience. And figure 3, what does that mean? You're giving a presentation. So it's showing the audience you're just dragging stuff in from somewhere. So I took this and spent just a few minutes playing with it. And again, in PowerPoint, the tools for cropping and duplicating and cutting things down and changing sizes are extremely effective. And you can balance things and put them in your slide and design them in many different ways, okay? So I just chewed on this for, I don't know, less than 10 minutes and came up with this, okay? Well, again, we'll flip around between that, okay, and this. Cropped all the white stuff off, put a background on so it pops out much larger, and I put my own labels on there, okay? So all of a sudden, the thing that you want to present in your PowerPoint presentation, which is really probably the details of the hyphae and the hyphae growth, that's where you focus. Trim all the other stuff off, okay? All this background, okay? So I put nice little colors on there, it pops out, and I put the title across the top. So that, I really think that was about 10 minutes of my time, and it just looks like such a more attractive presentation. One thing I haven't done, though, if this is somebody else's presentation, is I haven't given I haven't acknowledged the person that created these data. And I often get questions about this in my presentation. So how do you cite other people? If I'm pulling things off publications or the internet, how do you cite this? In this case, I've pulled off a model off the internet. This is from published copyright, the American Association for Cancer Research. You can't quite see that there, with a little arrow. So what you can do is just put the author, the journal, and so on. And you make sure the audience can see it, but it doesn't have to be overly large unless you really want to highlight it. But if you're pulling in models and other people's research that they've published directly, copy-paste, I think it's the right thing to do. It's appropriate to cite that publication. Okay? You're showing scientific data, results, models, and so on. However, if you're just pulling things off the internet, images to help lubricate your talk, in this case, an image of Arabidopsis. I want to talk about Arabidopsis. I don't have a picture. I just pull this off a Wikimedia site. I don't think it's necessary to drop in the URL for every single image you show. Okay? So if you're pulling something in off a publication, I think it's appropriate. But I think you should use your common sense and decide. And if you're not sure, if you're really uncomfortable about presenting somebody else's research, and you're not sure if they'd want to, it's also okay to contact them and ask, is it acceptable that I take this figure? It's in the public domain. They're publishing it, right? And they would be delighted, I'm sure, that you're going to talk about it. As long as it's in a positive light, they'll be delighted that you are going to talk about it. But acknowledge them and present it. That's the nature of publications. Okay. So cite others where appropriate. I'm going to show some other examples of presentations and things that haven't gone so well. And again, I can't interact with the audience at this point because I have nobody in the room with me. But let's talk about problems. I asked somebody in my lab, was there a question?
Oh, yep. Actually, Joss, this is Melanie. If we were going to transition a little bit away from this topic, we did have one question about if you have any advice on how best our presenters can use audio clips or video clips in a presentation. if they come across something?
Yeah, it's a great question. So how do we use audio clips and video clips? So make sure that the audience understand the context. Again, PowerPoint is so versatile now. You can drop in videos and all sorts of things. And they can be a very, very effective way of presenting lots and lots of information, right? The whole picture paints 1,000 words. So you can put these video presentations in, give context for it, okay? Explain what the audience are going to see. Because sometimes when you click go in the video, you know what the video is, and you'll have a tendency to talk over the top of it. The audience's brain is looking at stuff, spinning and moving, and they're listening, and they're trying to assimilate two things. So help them out a little bit and say, so I'm going to show you a video now of, or an audio clip of, and just give them a clue as to what they're going to watch. And then as you give the audio particular video, make sure that you've practiced timing the presentation so it matches. And I've heard seen a couple of video clips where it's quite a long video clip, and the person says everything really fast, and then there's this sort of uncomfortable silence where not very much happens, really. So make sure that the video clip's not too long, is appropriately sized. Explain very briefly what you're going to see. I'm going to show you a clip about this, and then that's fine. And you can also, doesn't do any harm to review it as well. Okay, video can be extremely effective, so that's a good question. So very quickly, then I asked somebody from my lab to prepare a slide for me. I was giving a talk. It was about my spectrometry, different kinds, and I got this slide. You have this in front of you, so I don't need to over egg this, but it contravenes many of the rules, suggestions that I've already talked about for the last half an hour about colors and size and space. You can see, first of all, tons of information on the slide. Okay, I want to talk about two kinds of mass spectrometry: MALDI-TOF and electrospray. Everything's on one slide. So number one, okay, let's break it down into two halves. Let's start off by showing this. Tons of text, a lot going on. Animation might be useful. Then I'll bring this in later on, maybe to contrast it. The color scheme's horrendous, okay? So you've got pink on blue. You can't read half of that. At the back of the room, much of the audience would not see this, okay? Lots and lots of blah, blah, blah text. Trim all that out, put a few nouns in, and build on that, okay? And got a white background. So all in all, it's not an effective presentation at all. This was another slide that came along with it, which again, I put a black background on. The thing that was most important about the presentation was actually this bit. So the bit that was important about the whole slide was shrunk down to less than 10% of the actual screen. All this stuff wasn't important, and there was a sort of mystery animation that popped up for no apparent reason. No labels, no description. So somebody at the back of the room has no idea what's going on, all right? This is what we really care about. So designing your space, designing the timing, designing the background, all very important, and figuring out how you want to present the information in a very measured way. Another awfulness, so here we have Times New Roman fonts, other fonts up here. I don't know where to look. There's tons of stuff happening. There is an arrow going this way, but this is part of it, and here we have all sorts of stuff. So the things being cropped and crunched together, and the axis label is all messed up. And so again, it's just very poorly designed. So think about how you might want to redesign that. So these kinds of things are all critical because they show the audience. Number one, they help the audience understand, but they show that you put a lot of thought into how you've designed all of these things. Okay, so take the time to design everything beautifully and figure out how you're going to lay it out. Okay, these are some presentation aspects for the data, the results, but there's also you. Okay, you're presenting yourself as a scientist, and it's something that's worth spending some time thinking about. How do you want to come across to your audience? Okay, is it appropriate? Is it a is it an informal group that's people coming together from across campus? It's a bunch of postdocs and students, and you're having pizza. That's fine. Or is it a very formal, you're the plenary speaker at the international meeting of whatever it is, okay? So you can judge things accordingly. Is it more serious? Is it more casual? Is it much more educational or much more descriptive and entertaining, and you're interacting a lot more with the audience? So think a little bit about how you want to come across. Regardless, this is fairly informal, okay? I'd still put a shirt on. I want to come across as I'm not a serious person, that's the incorrect way of saying it, but I want to come across as a professional. I want to show that I take this presentation to you seriously. You're giving up your time, you've come here, and I really appreciate that, and so I want to acknowledge that. So just bear that in mind. Think about the presentation style, and again, it's different levels of energy, different levels of speed, and so on. These are all appropriate for different audiences. They also match your personality. Some people don't jump up and down, do star jumps and leap around and stroll around the podium, okay? Some people sit very calmly and very slowly, and this is how they would like to give their presentation. And it can be a fantastic presentation, just very calmly and in a very measured way. Other people like to jump about and grab the audience that way. It's different styles. It's very good that there are different sorts of styles. However, one thing I would suggest is that you think about the speed of your delivery while you're practicing. So we all tend, I think, when we get a little bit anxious, a bit nervous, to speak a little bit faster. And the problem with that is that you can then not measure in time and make yourself as coherent as you might. So one of the things I would suggest, and this really also helps with the anxiety levels, is to pause and breathe. Breathing is really good, turns out. We like breathing. So taking a breath and pausing can calm you down. You'll feel more calm and enjoy the process a lot more. But one thing that's quite interesting is that putting pauses into your presentation can feel a little bit unnatural when you do it normally, when you're talking to your friends. But in a seminar where you're presenting lots of information, putting in pauses and gaps and allowing the audience to digest what you're saying can be extremely effective. So I'll give you an example. I can talk like this, show you something on the screen. And then we look over here and you can see there's something happening on this part of the screen. And I'm breathing and I'm slowing everything down. And you're still paying attention. You're still listening to me. You're not thinking, that sounds really strange. If I talk to you over a cup of coffee in a coffee shop, that might sound a bit odd. But in a formal setting, giving a seminar, it really helps the audience understand. This is particularly when you're giving a scientific presentation, because you're communicating lots and lots of information. You know your story. You've been studying this thing. You've been at the bench generating the data, making the slides, analyzing it. You know the data back to front, upside down. Your audience, mostly, are hearing it for the first time. So if they have a giant fire hose of data coming at them and information, it's quite hard to keep up to date. What is he talking about now? And you're flying along at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But if you show something, and in this graph we have this, and the next we examine that, and we pause, you'll feel so much more comfortable. And it will actually come across in a much more effective way. So in general, turn the speed right down, slow down, breathe, get a cup of water. That's fine. And it doesn't come across as at all strange, okay? And so you've finished giving your presentation, you've reviewed it, I've explained to you what I wanted to say, and don't forget to say thank you, all right? You're there not as a solo scientist, but as a result of working in your lab, your advisor, your colleagues in the lab, someone that gave you some plants, your committee, whoever it might be, okay? Say thank you very much, because you're building upon a lot of hard work. Hang on, there's more. We're not done yet, right? What could there be? You've given your presentation, you've said thank you. No, there's the questions, okay? So there's always the section at the end where you have 5 minutes typically for questions. We'll have this at the end of this presentation. So what reaction are you going to get? You're very unlikely ever to get something like this, okay? I've never been in a seminar. No, not true. One time I saw two very, very senior scientists have a go at each other, and they were very renowned scientists in their field, and this is being recorded, so I'm not going to say who they were, but they had a go at each other, and everybody knew that this was coming. They feuded constantly at meetings and disagreed with each other. But in your experience as a scientist, unless you want it, you will never have somebody getting up after your talk and getting up in your face. Okay, it won't happen. I can't guarantee you won't have some people that are having a snooze at the end. But the question is, what sort of questions are you likely to get, and how are you going to react? So first of all, be prepared for the question. When you practice, Get some people to come in. Get your friends, your colleagues, whoever it might be, your lab mates. Get them to ask you questions. Anticipate what sorts of questions you might get. Ask yourself, well, I'm showing this new thing and it's controversial or it's a new piece of data. Probably they're going to want to know about this. Come up with your head as to what sorts of questions you might get. All right? Be prepared for the question to be repeated. And this is very common. You can be on the platform, your podium, giving your talk, question at the back of the room, hand goes up and you say yes. And you hear this, I'm sorry, can you please repeat that? I can't quite hear. Maybe the microphone hasn't reached the person or they've got a very quiet voice or it's muffled, whatever the reason. And you might have to ask them to repeat it once or twice. You can go a bit closer. Normally there's somebody that's presenting you that's on the podium as well, the person running the session or introducing you. You can ask to see if they've understood what was said. Okay. Normally repeating it will help. It'll help encourage the person to speak louder, more clearly, and they'll enunciate better. And you can hear what's going on. It can happen that you can't quite hear. So do your best. At some point, it might be that you simply cannot communicate, at which point you can say something like, along the lines of, I'm sorry, I just can't hear you given the acoustics of the room or whatever the reason is, but please come and see me afterwards. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Okay? And that's fine. Move on. The same thing, be prepared to say that you don't know. If someone asks you a question and says, how can you explain this? And you have absolutely no idea, never thought about it before, or you simply can't explain it. I think be absolutely honest and say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Always say, that's a great question. It's a very good question. Get the audience on your side. Thank the person for their question and be completely frank. I'm sorry, I don't know. I've never thought about that before. That's really good. Perhaps, again, we can talk about this later. Okay? And again, if you get into a discussion with somebody in the audience that you feel like you want to move on, you're not comfortable, things aren't going well, you're completely at liberty to say, thanks very much for your question. Perhaps we can talk about it afterwards. And you're sort of saying, you acknowledge them interacting with you, but you're also telling them that you don't want to continue this communication, which is fine. You have the stage. It's up to you. Okay? So you can move through. Overall, be cool, calm, and professional. And another little trap that's quite often, particularly early investigators fall into, is they get a bit giggly and they're so relieved that having finished their presentation, they're sort of, in the questions, they go all goofy, all right? And they start getting out of control. So while you're on the stage, you're a professional scientist, okay? And once you're done, you can be giggly in the audience when you go back, all right? So cool, calm, professional, engage with your audience, welcome questions, and do your best to answer them. Be prepared to say you don't know, okay? But once you're done, you're done. And to wrap up then, the most important piece of advice, this is absolutely right, is practice, practice, practice. And now, to this day, I've been droning on the audiences for years, okay? Senior scientists, you'll still give presentations. The best presentations are those that have been practiced. And I've been to many talks where very senior, wonderful scientists have got up and they've thrown a slide presentation up there, and it's, you know, a 50-minute presentation and they've got 130 slides and they're fast forwarding, oh, I don't want to talk about that, oh, I don't know, and they'll click through, or they won't get near to finishing, and it's people are, well, I need to go to the next session, there's another meeting over there. Time things, practice things, make sure that everything works out as you want, okay? And if you're not happy with it, get advice, get people to come in and ask them to give you frank feedback. Say, don't wear gloves, tell me what you liked and what you didn't like, and be prepared to accept that advice. But practice, practice, practice. You know how long your talk is, you know what the slides are, you know the transitions between slides, that's very important, what's coming next. If you practice, you will give a great presentation. Thank you very much. And as I would say at all my talks, thank you again for inviting me. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Joss. This is Melanie, and this is actually a good question that's feeding right into your last topic of practice, practice, practice. We had a question about someone who gets terrible stage fright, and beyond practicing, do you have any other tips on keeping calm?
So what I found, I mean, I can give you a horror story. When I first started giving seminars, I won't even tell you how it was utter embarrassment. It was a complete horror show. But I found I got confident literally by literally by slowing down and breathing. Breathing is so important. Taking a breath, letting it out, while the audience is doing this, can be enormously effective, okay? But again, this happens whether you're giving a public seminar or whether you're talking to any kind of meeting or group, okay? We tend to get anxious. So all I can say is try and get it in context and think every single person in that audience is interested in what you have to say. They're your friend. They're engaged. They're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, okay? So if you practice everything and you know what you're going to say, you know your 15 slides back to front because, God, you're bored of them. You've been going over and over and over, okay? Then that helps you a lot because it's almost an automatic process. But just slow down. And if you're feeling yourself getting anxious, look at the data, take a breath, and turn back again, okay? And I found that slowing things down and taking breaths, rather than speeding up to try and get off the stage as quick as possible, slow it right down, and then you will generally feel much calmer.
Thank you. Great advice. And I have, this question is more of a technical nature on using images and figures that are best seen with high resolution. If you have any tips for that, as a presenter, should you try not to use them since projectors could be low quality or hard to see from the back, or is there a way to adjust for that?
So things that you want to see in high resolution is the concern. How to deal with that? Yes,
if they need to be, if they're best seen with high resolution.
So one thing you can do is, so don't forget, this is your palette. This is the space in which you're working. So one of the things you can do is show the overall image, and then if you want to zoom in or magnify things that need to be high resolution, you can then take that image, duplicate it, expand it out, crop it, and zoom right into the bit you really want to show, and then animate it and drop it down on top of the first picture. So you show the overview, animate it, boom, up comes the super high resolution part you want to show, okay? And if it's ultra high resolution, you're at the mercy of where you're working, but I think projectors these days are generally very effective. So I think in the context of a presentation, you can zoom in with images as much as you want by dropping layers on.
Okay, great. And I've got one question also as well about the actual physical part of the presentation. Is it okay for the presenter to move on stage left and right to explain the slides?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, again, I think the thing to do is to help entertain the audience, right? And be careful where you're going because sometimes you're wired for sound, so don't trip up. But it's fine to stand still. I tend to move a little bit, but to stay on one side. But some people will pace across the front. I may or may not be dropping off the screen show here, but they'll pace over here and they'll come over here and they'll talk about this. Then they might walk back and they'll be over here. It's a very typical TED talk, right? You walk around a lot. You have a little space. You roam about. You don't want it to be distracting, but at the same time, it can really engage the audience. So the point is they're here quite often to listen to you, but they're also here to watch what you're showing. With a TED talk, it tends to be somebody where all the focus is on one person. I'm the presenter. It's all about me. And you can move around, and it's quite interesting. With a PowerPoint presentation, it tends to be much more, I need you also to direct your attention here. And if you're looking over here and I'm roaming about all over the place, leaping up and down the stage, it can be a distraction. So timing that movement can be very helpful. There's no reason why you can't do this. Talk about it a little bit, pivot, and do this. But think a little bit about where you want their focus and attention to be.
And I think this is another good question leading into that about maybe if your hands are shaking while you're using a pointer, you know, how do you manage that, or do you have any advice for that?
So you've got normally you've got two hands, okay? Judicious use of the pointer is important. So don't have it like this when you're talking, because then you'll see the nerves will go, right? The pointer is to be used to emphasize one thing. So there. So use it for short periods of time. On this slide here, you move your arm in one direction. It's moving, right? This, turn it off. So the problem you will see is that people will sit there like this, right? And they'll be using their lightsaber, or they'll be swinging it around the audience, okay? So don't leave it on. Then you won't see that your hands are shaking. Do it as a movement, or just point it.
Okay, great. Mary or Natalie, do you guys have any other questions?
I have a couple of comments. This is Mary. Hi.
Yeah.
First of all, I really wanted to emphasize the point you made about say things 3 times. I think that is such important advice when you're talking, and certainly when you're teaching. This is what I'm going to tell you, this is what I told you, I am telling you, and this is what I told you, and in the talk as well, because that seems to be the most effective way to get people to really hear what you're saying and remember it. And then the second one was a comment that somebody made to me after I gave my first talk as a graduate student, and I was introduced and I basically just launched right into my title slide. And the point they made was before you start sort of talking about your slides, look at the audience and acknowledge them and make eye contact. And I always try and do that because it kind of forges a little bond between you and the audience if you acknowledge their presence and welcome them and stuff, rather than sort of hiding essentially behind, the arch and not pretending like they're not there. So I thought that was a good tip to pass on as well. Natalie, go on.
Absolutely, and I think a good time to do that is when you're thanking the person for inviting you, right? The first thing you say is, I'd like to thank you for the introduction, Melanie. I'd like to thank you all for coming to my talk today. That's a good time to kind of, as you say, very good, Mary, pan across and look at everybody.
Natalie, did you want to follow up?
I think those are really great points. Thanks, Mary. I do see a couple of other questions coming through in the slides, and I think there's been a couple of questions related to co-authors or acknowledgements. How would you recommend we deal with those sorts of issues?
So it depends on, so as students and postdocs, and this is the audience to whom I'm talking today, I think you want to say, you typically would say at the end of your talk, I'd like to thank the people in my lab for supporting me, and then you might want to pick out in particular people who've done a lot of the work. If somebody has done most of the work you're showing, or half of it, or a really significant portion of it, maybe, and in particular John Smith and Mary Doe, whoever it is, who did this and did that. Okay? If you really want to highlight something very specific, it's not uncommon that you are giving a talk on some aspect of a project, but there's a big chunk done by somebody else. So it might be appropriate then to highlight that. You don't want to go through a list of 20 names. Okay? That's probably not effective or appropriate. But I think if there's a significant portion of something, then think about actually mentioning very briefly what they did. So-and-so was responsible for the work on the transgenic plants, or so-and-so did this, and acknowledge. But the most important thing is that they're up on the slide somewhere, okay? Whether you get the additional verbal credit or not depends on, I think, their contribution to the work.
Okay.
What I think about it, one last thing I would like to say is, we're always looking to improve in everything we do, right? And so it would be very helpful, it's always helpful to talk to somebody, people you know, friends, colleagues later on, and ask if they have any feedback or suggestions as to how your talk might be improved, or any things they liked in particular. And I'm going to say that to you guys now as well. If there's anything about my presentation that you found particularly helpful, or any suggestions for improving it, anything you would say do differently, I would love to know, and all feedback is very welcome.
Excellent. Well, we do have a few more questions, but I think we'll move this over onto the Planté website and continue the discussion. I wanted to remind the Conviron scholars that they have an assignment, which is to develop a presentation and record themselves doing it. And we've written up extensive technical notes on different ways they can approach this task. So have a look at those. And so the first part is preparing an excellent presentation, and the second part is delivering it and recording it so that your colleagues in this group can watch you and give you feedback. The other thing I wanted to note is that for the Planté Fellows who are here, I just wanted to note that we have a couple of guest editors on the What We're Reading series coming up. And so have a look at the spreadsheet and make sure you send your summaries to the right people. So that was our messaging that had to go out. Melanie and Natalie?
I just have, well, first I want to thank Joss and his team for helping us set this up. This was great. We're really glad we were able to share this information this way. I think this was the perfect way to present